The air in the freight car was thick enough to chew. It tasted of grit, sun-baked iron, and the sweat of ghosts who had ridden this line before her. Each lurch and sway of the train was a brutal reminder to Clara that she was still moving, still breathing, still free. For now. She sat huddled on a pile of coarse burlap sacks in the corner, trying to make her body as small as the hope flickering in her chest. She was 18, but felt as ancient and worn as the New Mexico landscape rushing past the open doorway. It was a brutal canvas of bleached bone and thirsty earth, stretching into an endless, hazy horizon under a sun that offered no mercy, only judgment. Dust was her only constant companion. It settled in a fine, pale film on her dark hair, clung to the dampness of her skin, and lined her throat, making each swallow a painful scrape. She had been running for 2 days, fueled by a terror so profound it had burned away hunger and thirst, leaving only the primal instinct to put one foot in front of the other, to find a shadow to disappear into. The memory of the border town was a fresh wound. It wasn't the dirt streets or the hollow-eyed men that haunted her. It was the quiet finality in her father's eyes as he'd accepted the clink of coins, a sound that had sealed her fate. He hadn't sold his daughter. He had sold a piece of property he no longer wished to maintain. She was to belong to a man named Silas, whose saloon was less a place for drinking and more a marketplace for flesh. But she had seen the dead look in the eyes of the other girls who worked for him, a vacant surrender she refused to let take root in her own soul. So, before the first night, before he could claim his purchase, she had slipped out of a loose-paned window and run until the sounds of the town were swallowed by the chirping of crickets. The freight train had been her salvation, a groaning metal serpent moving slow enough for her to scramble aboard in the pre-dawn gloom. She'd found her way to the last car, an open-sided boxcar carrying nothing but a few forgotten sacks and the lingering smell of livestock. For hours, she had been alone, a silent passenger on a journey to nowhere in particular, anywhere but the place she'd left behind. Then she realized she wasn't alone. He had been there the whole time, a fixture in the opposite corner, so still and quiet she had mistaken him for a shadow or a pile of discarded gear. Now, as the afternoon sun slanted low, it caught the hard lines of his face and the immense stillness of his form. He was a tall man, long-limbed and broad-shouldered, folded into the corner with an economy of motion that suggested immense patience or profound weariness. His hat was pulled low, casting his eyes in shadow, but she could feel their weight. He wore a heavy duster coat, the color of the dust that covered everything, its fabric worn and stained by travel and time. His boots were scuffed but solid, planted firmly on the vibrating floorboards. His hands rested on his knees, large and calloused, knuckles scarred. They were hands that knew work, hard and unforgiving. Clara's first instinct was to freeze, to hold her breath and pray he hadn't noticed her, but he made no move. He just sat there, a silent sentinel watching the world burn away outside. Curiosity, a dangerous luxury, nudged at her fear. She watched him from beneath her lashes. He never fidgeted. The train's violent jolts seemed to be absorbed by his frame without disturbing his composure. He was like a rock formation, something carved from the landscape itself, impervious to the wind and the heat. She wondered what he was doing here. A man like that, with a stillness that spoke of confidence. Didn't seem the type to steal a ride on a freight train. He looked like he belonged on the back of a powerful horse, with the horizon as his only destination. After another hour of shared silence, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track, he shifted slightly. He reached into a pocket of his duster and pulled out a small, tarnished flask. He uncapped it, the sound a small metallic click in the vast emptiness, and took a short, deliberate swallow. He didn't drink like the men in town, gulping down whiskey to fuel their noise and their rage. He drank as if taking medicine. He capped the flask, returned it to his pocket, and resumed his motionless vigil, just as a fragile sense of calm began to settle over Clara. A new sound cut through the train's familiar song. Voices, male voices, loud and coarse, carried on the wind from a car further up the line. The sound was a spark to dry tinder in her gut. Her blood went cold. She pressed herself deeper into the corner, pulling the rough burlap tighter around her shoulders as if it could make her invisible. The train began to slow, its groans growing louder. The screech of metal on metal a torment to her frayed nerves. It wasn't stopping at a station. There was nothing out here but rock and sand. It was slowing for a water stop, or a crew change, a chance for them to move between the cars. The voices grew closer. There was laughter, a sharp, cruel sound that held no joy. "Swear I saw a slip of a thing near the back," one voice boomed. "Silas is offering a handsome price for her return," another voice answered, the words slithering into the car like snakes. "Said she was untouched, makes her worth more, he reckons." Panic seized Clara's throat, choking the air from her lungs. It was them, the men Silas would have sent. They were hunting her like an animal. Her eyes darted around the car. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Jumping from the moving train would mean broken bones, if not death. Staying meant being dragged back to a fate far worse. Her gaze fell, with desperate finality, on the silent man in the corner. He hadn't moved. His head was still angled down, the brim of his hat obscuring his face. Did he hear them? Did he care? He was a stranger. Worse, he was a man. And she had learned that men were the architects of her suffering. He had no reason to help her, every reason to ignore her, or even to turn her over for a share of the reward. But his stillness was her only option. It was the only thing in the entire world that wasn't moving, wasn't threatening, wasn't closing in. The heavy tread of boots sounded on the coupling just outside. They were coming into her car, scrambling on her hands and knees, the rough floorboards scraping her skin. Clara crossed the space between them. The movement was clumsy, born of pure terror. She stopped before him, a supplicant before a stone idol. He didn't move. She could only see the firm line of his jaw and the weathered skin of his neck. "Please," she whispered, the word a ragged puff of air. It was the smallest sound, nearly lost in the noise of the train, but in the space between them, it was a scream. The man, Elias Boone, slowly lifted his head. For the first time, she saw his eyes clearly. They were not dark, as she had imagined, but a pale, washed-out gray, the color of slate after a storm. There was no pity in them, no anger, no curiosity. They were flat, observant, and held a depth of stillness that seemed to swallow the light. He looked at her, his gaze taking in her torn dress, her bare, scratched feet, and the wild fear that made her tremble like a leaf. He saw the truth of her situation in a single, unblinking moment. The boots stomped into the car. Two men, burly and unshaven, reeking of sweat and cheap liquor, blocked the light from the doorway. Their eyes scanned the shadows. Clara's breath hitched in a sob. She looked back at the man, her eyes pleading with an intensity that transcended words. She didn't know his name. She didn't know if he was a good man or a bad one. She only knew he was her last chance. "Hide me," she breathed, the words barely audible. "Please, under your coat." Elias Boone did not speak. His expression did not change. The world seemed to slow down. The loud talk of the men, the rocking of the train, the pounding of her own heart, it all receded as he held her gaze. He simply watched her for a beat, his gray eyes searching hers for something she couldn't name. Then, in one smooth, deliberate motion that was devoid of any haste, he lifted the heavy woolen edge of his duster. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He simply created a space, a pocket of darkness in a world that had become too bright and too dangerous. It was an invitation, a silent, non-committal offer of shadow. Without a second of hesitation, Clara scrambled forward and curled herself into the small space beside his leg. Disappearing beneath the heavy fabric, the world outside vanished. She was enveloped in darkness, the scent of dust, worn leather, and something else, something clean and elemental, like rain on dry earth. The thick wool muffled the sound of the men's voices. She could feel the solid, unyielding strength of his leg against her back, a warm, living wall. She held her breath, pressing her face against the rough denim of his trousers, praying that the frantic beating of her heart was not as loud to the world as it was to her own ears. She was hidden. She was still, and for the first time in 2 days, she was not alone in her fear. Under the heavy wool of the duster, the world was a universe of sound and sensation. Clara could hear the gruff voices of the men, their words muffled but their tone a clear and present danger. She felt the vibration of their heavy boots on the floorboards, each step a hammer blow against her heart. The scent of stale sweat and whiskey reached her even in her hiding place, a foul reminder of the men in Silas's saloon. She pressed her cheek harder against the rough fabric of Elias Boone's trousers, trying to will herself into non-existence. "Just the one of you, friend." It was the louder of the two voices, laced with a casual menace. There was a pause. Clara imagined the man, Elias, looking up at them with those flat, gray eyes. She waited for him to speak, to betray her, to say anything at all. The silence stretched, thin and taut. He didn't move a muscle. His stillness was absolute, a silent refusal to engage that was more powerful than any word. "Cat got your tongue," the second man sneered. "We're looking for something. A girl. Slipped out of Black Creek. You see anything?" Again, the crushing silence. Clara could feel the tension radiating from the man beside her. It wasn't fear, it was something else, something coiled and waiting, like a predator in the brush, perfectly still before the strike. "He's got something under that big coat," the first man said, his voice closer now. "Look at him, sitting all bunched up." A boot scuffed the floor, coming nearer. This was it. The air in her lungs turned to fire. She was trapped. A small, choked gasp escaped her lips, a sound so faint she barely heard it herself. But in the charged quiet of the car, it was like a gunshot. The reaction was instantaneous. It was not a decision, it was an event, as sudden and irreversible as a lightning strike. The air exploded around her. One moment she was huddled in darkness. The next she was being lifted, the duster flying open. Elias moved with a speed that defied his size and stillness. He wasn't scrambling. He was uncoiling. His left arm wrapped around her waist like a band of iron, hoisting her off the floor as if she weighed nothing. Her feet left the ground, and she saw a flash of the men's shocked faces, their mouths open, hands reaching. Then the world became a blur of brown and blue. He didn't run toward the end of the car. He pivoted directly toward the open side. For a terrifying, heart-stopping second, they were airborne. The wind ripped the breath from her lungs. She saw the ground rushing up to meet them, a churn of gravel, sand, and thorny scrub. She squeezed her eyes shut and clung to him, a silent scream trapped in her throat. They hit the ground with a force that jarred every bone in her body. Elias took the brunt of the impact, his broad back and shoulder absorbing the shock. He didn't just fall, he rolled, tucking his body around hers, shielding her from the jagged rocks and rough earth. They tumbled over once, twice, a chaotic mix of limbs and dust and the tearing sound of fabric, when they finally came to a stop in a cloud of their own making. Clara was lying half on top of him, gasping for air, her head spinning. The train was already pulling away, its clatter receding, the shouts of the men on board fading into the vast, indifferent silence of the desert. Pain flared along her side and in her elbow where she'd struck the ground. She coughed, her throat raw with dust. But she was alive. She was free. Elias pushed himself up, dislodging her gently. He moved with a grim efficiency, his face a mask of stone. A long scrape ran down his forearm, welling with blood. But he paid it no mind. His gray eyes were already scanning the landscape, assessing, calculating. He looked back at the receding train, a dark line shrinking against the horizon. then toward a distant formation of deep red rocks that jutted from the plains like broken teeth. "Get up," he said. His voice was a low rasp, the first words he had spoken to her. It was not unkind, but it was completely devoid of comfort. It was a command born of necessity. Clara scrambled to her feet, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. Her simple dress was torn at the hem, and her skin was peppered with small cuts and scrapes. She looked at him, this stranger who had just thrown himself from a moving train for her. "Why?" she began, but he cut her off. "They'll stop the train," he said, his gaze fixed on the red rocks. "They'll come back. We have to move, now." He turned and began to walk. Not run, with a long, ground-eating stride that forced her into a trot to keep up. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a wave of exhaustion and pain. But the fear remained, a cold knot in her stomach. The men would be coming. The thought of their hands on her, of being dragged back to Silas, was enough to make her move. The terrain was brutal. The ground was a hard-baked pan of clay and gravel, interspersed with sharp-edged rocks and clumps of creosote bush, whose branches seemed to grab at her clothes and skin. Her thin shoes, meant for town streets, were no match for the wilderness. Within the first quarter-mile, she felt the sole of her left shoe begin to tear away. Elias moved through it all as if he were born to it. His scuffed boots found purchase where she could find none. He navigated the treacherous ground without hesitation, his eyes constantly moving, reading the landscape like a map he knew by heart. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He simply assumed she was. They reached the base of the red rock formations, a maze of canyons and weathered pillars of stone. The air grew hotter here, the heat radiating off the sandstone walls. Elias led her into a narrow gap between two towering cliffs, the shadows offering a brief, welcome respite from the relentless sun. He stopped abruptly in a small, sandy alcove. "Stay here, don't move," he ordered. He disappeared around a bend, leaving her alone in the oppressive silence. Clara leaned against the warm rock, her lungs burning, her heart still hammering against her ribs. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. She strained her ears, listening for the sound of pursuit over the blood rushing in her head. She was utterly, terrifyingly dependent on a man she did not know, a man who had not offered a single word of reassurance. He returned minutes later, his hands full of dry brush and dead wood. He dropped it in the center of the alcove and, kneeling, pulled a small tin from his pocket. Inside were flint, steel, and char cloth, with a few practiced, economical movements. He struck a spark. It caught in the tinder, and he gently blew it to life, adding twigs until a small, steady flame was established. Then he began piling on the greenest, most resinous branches he had collected. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Buying time," he said, not looking at her. He arranged the green wood carefully over the flames. Within moments, a thick plume of white smoke began to rise, curling lazily upward before being caught by the breeze and pulled out over the plains. It was a clear, unambiguous signal. Anyone looking for them would see it and assume they were holed up in the canyons. He stood and stamped out the base of the fire, leaving the green wood to smolder and smoke. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not painful. "This way!" He pulled her deeper into the labyrinth of rock, moving away from the decoy smoke. They scrambled up a steep incline of loose shale, the rocks skittering away underfoot. Clara slipped, her worn shoe giving way completely. She cried out as her ankle twisted, sending a lance of pain up her leg. She went down hard on one knee. Elias stopped instantly. He turned and looked down at her, his face unreadable. For a moment, she thought he would leave her there. He had saved her once. He owed her nothing more. The thought was so terrifying it made her forget the pain in her ankle. He reached down and took her hand. His palm was rough and calloused, the skin like old leather, but his grip was steady. He pulled her to her feet. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded, not trusting her voice. The pain was sharp, but the fear was sharper. He didn't let go of her hand. Instead, he adjusted his grip, lacing his fingers through hers, and started moving again, pulling her along behind him. His hand was a lifeline. It was an anchor in a world that had been tilted on its axis. It was strong, impersonal, and utterly dependable. They moved faster now, his strength compensating for her weakness. When she stumbled over a loose rock, his grip tightened, keeping her upright. When she hesitated at a steep drop, he went first, turning to lower her down, his hand a firm, unshakable point of contact. They ran until the sun beat down on them with a physical weight, until Clara's lungs felt as if they were filled with hot sand. The world dissolved into a rhythm of pain and motion, the jarring impact of her feet on the hard ground, the burning in her muscles, the sawing of her own breath, and the constant, steady pressure of his hand holding hers. She fell again, this time her exhaustion overwhelming her. Her legs simply gave out, and she crumpled to the ground, the unforgiving earth scraping her hands and knees. Sobs of frustration and pain shook her body. "I can't," she gasped, tears tracing clean paths through the grime on her face. "I can't go on." Elias stopped and stood over her, his tall frame blocking the sun. He looked down at her, his shadow a small pool of mercy. He was breathing heavily, a sheen of sweat on his brow, but his expression was unchanged. He let go of her hand and she felt a pang of loss, as if he'd cut the last rope holding her to safety. He knelt beside her, not in a gesture of comfort, but of practicality. He looked at her ruined shoes, then at her bleeding feet. Without a word, he reached for his flask, uncapped it, and poured a small amount of water onto a corner of his bandana. He gently, almost clinically, wiped the grit from the worst of her cuts. The touch was brief, businesslike, yet it was the most tender thing anyone had done for her in years. He stood up and held his hand out to her again. "They are not men who will stop," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Get up." It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. There was no choice. She looked at his outstretched hand, calloused and capable. It was the hand that had pulled her from the train, the hand that had steadied her, the hand that had not let go. She took it. He pulled her to her feet, his strength flowing into her, and once again, they moved on. Two small figures fleeing across an immense and hostile landscape, bound together by a shared flight and a silent, unbreakable grip. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the endless expanse of baked earth. Clara had lost all sense of time, her world reduced to the simple, agonizing act of putting one foot in front of the other. The landscape had become a blur of shimmering heat and monotonous brown. The only constant was the steady, unyielding presence of Elias Boone's hand in hers. It was no longer a comfort. It was a physical part of her, the point of contact that kept her tethered to the world of the living. Her throat was a desert. Her feet were a symphony of raw pain, and her will had been ground down to a single, desperate grain survive the next step. Just when she was certain she would collapse and be swallowed by the dust, she felt a subtle change in the rhythm of his stride. His pace, which had been relentless, eased almost imperceptibly. She risked a glance upward, her eyes gritty and sore. The terrain was changing. The flat, featureless plain was beginning to give way to rolling, scrub-dotted hills. In the far distance, a solitary line of cottonwood trees broke the horizon, a smudge of dark green that promised water. Hope, a feeling she thought had been burned out of her, flickered faintly. They walked for another hour, the green smudge growing slowly larger, resolving itself into a thin, vital ribbon along a dry creek bed. Tucked into a shallow depression, sheltered by a low mesa that rose behind it like a protective wall, was a structure. It was not a town, not even a settlement. It was a single, solitary homestead, weathered by sun and wind until it seemed a natural extension of the landscape itself. As they drew closer, the details emerged. A small, sturdy cabin built of sun-bleached timber and adobe, its roof patched in several places. A corral, its fences straight and well-maintained, stood empty save for a water trough. A tall, skeletal windmill turned slowly, its creak and groan the only sound in the vast silence. It was a place built for endurance, not comfort, a testament to a life of solitude and unceasing labor. This was his home, the edge of nowhere. Elias did not speak as he led her across the hard-packed yard. He dropped her hand only to unlatch the simple wooden gate of a small fence enclosing the cabin. He pushed open the heavy plank door and stood aside, a silent invitation for her to enter. Clara hesitated on the threshold, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the dim interior. The inside of the cabin was a single room, larger than it looked from the outside, but profoundly simple. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed, neatly made with a dark wool blanket, occupied a corner. The few possessions were utilitarian, a cast-iron skillet hanging by the hearth, a rifle mounted on the wall, a small stack of books on a crate. The air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and clean earth. It was a space stripped of everything but the essential. It was a reflection of the man himself. He followed her in, closing the door behind them, shutting out the harsh glare of the sun. The sudden quiet was profound. He crossed to a bucket of water on a stand, dipped a tin cup, and held it out to her. Clara took it with trembling hands, the metal cool against her skin. She drank greedily, the water tasting sweeter than anything she had ever known. It was life. He refilled the cup for her twice more before he drank himself, a long, deep swallow. He gestured toward one of the chairs at the table. "Sit." She obeyed, sinking onto the hard wood, the muscles in her legs quivering with relief. He stood for a moment, his gray eyes assessing her, the torn dress, the bloody feet, the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. She expected questions now. "Who are you? Why were they chasing you? What trouble have you brought to my door?" She braced herself for the interrogation, for the need to justify her existence, to barter her story for his protection. But the questions never came. He simply turned away and walked toward a curtain that partitioned off a small section of the cabin. "Benji," he called, his voice softer than she had yet heard it. "Come on out." The curtain rustled, and a small boy emerged, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He couldn't have been more than 7 years old, with a shock of sandy brown hair and wide, curious brown eyes that were a stark contrast to Elias's stoic gray. He was wearing a simple homespun shirt and trousers that were a little too big for him. He saw Clara and stopped, his curiosity immediately warring with a deep-seated shyness. He took a half-step back, hiding partially behind Elias's long leg, peering at her as if she were a strange creature he'd never seen before. "This is Clara," Elias said, his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. "She'll be staying for a spell." It was a statement of fact, delivered with a quiet finality that left no room for argument. She'll be staying, just like that. Benji just stared, his thumb finding its way into his mouth. Clara, despite her pain and exhaustion, felt a faint smile touch her lips. She tried to make it reassuring, not wanting to frighten the child. The presence of the boy changed everything. This harsh, silent man, this rock-carved survivor, had a child in his care. He wasn't just a solitary drifter, he was a guardian. The thought settled in her heart, a small, warm stone. Elias turned his attention back to Clara. He went to a chest at the foot of his bed and pulled out a clean linen shirt, much too large for her, and a small pile of clean rags. He then retrieved the water bucket and a basin. He set it all on the floor beside her chair. "The back room is yours," he said, gesturing with his head toward the curtain the boy had come from. "Clean yourself up. There's salve in the small tin on the shelf." He and the boy moved to the fireplace, their backs to her, giving her privacy. Elias began to prepare a simple meal, the sounds of him stoking the fire and slicing jerky filling the quiet room. Benji sat on the floor, watching his every move, the two of them existing in a comfortable, practiced silence. Clara slowly, painfully, pulled the basin closer. She dipped a rag in the cool water and began to clean the cuts on her feet and arms. The sting was sharp, but it was a clean pain, a healing pain. She worked methodically, washing away the dust and blood of her flight, and with it, some of the terror. No one was asking her anything. No one was demanding an explanation, in a world that had tried to turn her into an object to be bought and sold. Elias Boone had given her something she hadn't realized. She'd lost the simple dignity of being left alone. Later, after she had changed into the clean shirt, which hung on her like a tent, and treated her wounds with the soothing salve, Elias placed a plate of jerky and hardtack on the table in front of her. It was plain, rough food, but she ate it with a gratitude that was almost painful. Benji sat opposite her, nibbling on his own portion, his shy glances becoming more frequent. She slept in the small room behind the curtain on a pallet of soft furs that smelled faintly of sage. It was a dreamless, bottomless sleep, the first true rest she'd had in what felt like a lifetime. When she woke, the cabin was filled with the soft gray light of dawn. The pallet where Elias had presumably slept on the main floor was empty, and the blanket was already neatly folded. Through the cabin's single window, she could see him in the corral, mending a section of the fence with the same focused, economical movements he applied to everything. He was a man in his element, a part of the quiet morning rhythm of his own creation. A feeling of uselessness washed over her. She was a burden. She was taking this man's food, occupying his home, bringing danger to his doorstep. The old anxieties, the feeling of being worthless property, began to creep back in. She had to do something. It wasn't about repaying him. She had nothing to give. It was about needing to feel like she was more than just a stray he had taken in. It was about proving to herself that her hands were still capable of useful work. She got up, her body aching with a deep, satisfying soreness. Benji was sitting at the table, carefully drawing on a piece of slate with a nub of chalk. He looked up when she emerged, offering a small, tentative smile this time. She smiled back. On the washstand were the tin plates and cups from last night's meal. It was a small thing, but it was something to do. She took the plates to the basin, found a rough bar of soap, and began to wash them. The simple, repetitive motion was calming. The scrape of the cloth against the tin, the slosh of the water, the feeling of creating order from a small bit of chaos, it grounded her. When she was done, she saw one of Benji's shirts lying on a chair, a long tear in the sleeve. She found a needle and thread in a small sewing kit on a shelf and sat down. Her fingers, though clumsy at first, remembered the motions her mother had taught her long ago. She stitched the tear with small, even stitches, losing herself in the task. Benji came over and watched her, his chin resting on the table, his brown eyes wide with interest. He didn't speak, but his presence was a quiet companionship. When she finished, she held it up for him. He looked at the neat seam and then up at her, and his smile was brighter this time. She looked out the window again. Elias was leading a horse from a small lean-to, preparing for the day's work. He must have seen her through the window, moving about the cabin, but he gave no sign. He didn't call out to thank her. He didn't tell her to stop. He simply allowed it. He let her find her own small place in the quiet, fragile piece of his home, one small, useful task at a time. And for Clara, that silent acceptance was worth more than all the words in the world. A routine began to form in the quiet cabin, as gentle and predictable as the rising and setting of the sun. Days were measured not by the hands of a clock, but by the shifting of shadows across the floor and the simple, necessary tasks that gave life its shape. Elias would rise before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to wake her or the boy. Clara would hear the soft scrape of his boots on the floorboards, the splash of water as he washed his face, and the quiet click of the door as he went out to tend to the horse and the small world he had carved from the wilderness. She would rise soon after, finding the fire already rekindled, a low, steady heart of warmth in the cool morning air. While Benji slept on, she would take her place in the rhythm of the household. She swept the floor, her motions slow and deliberate. She learned to grind the corn for their morning meal, the grating sound of stone on stone a comforting, solid reality. There was a peace in these tasks, a sense of purpose that began to knit together the frayed edges of her soul. She was not a guest, not a prisoner, but a part of the quiet, functioning whole. This morning was like the others. Elias had returned from his chores and was sitting at the table, mending a piece of leather tack. His large hands, which she had once seen as only scarred and capable of immense force, now seemed to her instruments of creation and repair. He worked in silence, his focus absolute. Benji was outside, chasing a lizard near the woodpile, his occasional shouts of delight the only punctuation in the vast quiet. Clara stood at the wash basin, her hands submerged in warm, soapy water. She was washing the plates from their morning meal, her fingers tracing the simple, unadorned patterns of the tin. The sun streamed through the single window, catching the soap bubbles and turning them into tiny, fleeting rainbows. It was a moment of profound, ordinary peace. And it was this very peace that unsettled her. It felt undeserved, a stolen thing. It was a life she had no right to, built upon a foundation of silence and unanswered questions. He had not asked her a single thing about her past. He had treated her not as a mystery to be solved, but as a fact to be accepted. He had given her shelter, food, and an unspoken, unconditional safety. But the story she carried was a heavy, toxic thing inside her, and she felt its poison seeping into the clean air of this place. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with everything she hadn't said. She felt like a fraud, a liar by omission, accepting his quiet decency while hiding the ugliness of her truth. She looked at his bent head, the way his dark hair curled slightly over the collar of his worn shirt. He was a good man, a hard man, certainly, and one who held the world at a distance. But a good man. She saw it in the way his hand rested on Benji's shoulder, in the patience with which he mended the broken strap, in the simple fact that he had thrown himself from a moving train for a girl he did not know. He deserved to know what kind of trouble he had sheltered. Her own hand stilled in the water. The soap bubbles popped and vanished. Her heart began to beat a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. "My father," she said, her voice small and tight, startling in the quiet room. Elias stopped his work. He didn't look up immediately, but the motion of his hands ceased. He laid the awl and the piece of leather carefully on the table, giving her his complete, undivided stillness. She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. He liked to play cards, more than he liked to work the small plot of land we had. He was good at losing. She scrubbed at a plate that was already clean, her knuckles white. The debts grew. He started drinking more. The drinking made the card playing worse. She was speaking to the basin of water, to the reflection of her own haunted face. She could feel Elias's gaze on her, steady and patient, not pressing, just waiting. There was a man, Silas, the one who owned the saloon in Black Creek. The name was acid on her tongue. My father owed him everything, the land, the mule, everything we had. And it still wasn't enough. She paused, the memory of physical weight in her chest. So he made a new wager, a final one. He used the only thing he had left. She looked up then, and met his eyes. The pale slate gray of them held no judgment, only a deep, unwavering attention. He knew what she was going to say. Maybe he had known all along. "He sold me to him," she whispered, the words finally breaking free, raw and shameful. "For $100 and the forgiveness of his debt. I was to I was to work in the saloon, with the other girls. The silence that followed was immense. It filled the cabin, pushing against the walls. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see Benji abandon his lizard hunt and come to peek in the doorway. Drawn by the sudden shift in the atmosphere, Elias gave the boy a nearly imperceptible shake of his head, and Benji, understanding a language that needed no words, retreated back into the sunlight. Clara's shoulders began to shake. She had said it. The ugliest truth of her life was now out in the open, hanging in the air between them. She felt naked, exposed, waiting for the disgust, the pity, the revulsion, waiting for him to tell her to leave, to take her dirtiness away from his clean, simple life. I ran away, she continued, her voice trembling, desperate for him to know the rest. That night, before anything happened, before he could... She couldn't finish the sentence. The shame was a hand squeezing her throat. She took a ragged breath and forced out the words that were at the very core of her fear and her identity. I'm not like the others, she said, her gaze dropping back to her white-knuckled hands in the water. I'm still a virgin. I escaped before that first night. There it was, her last secret, her last defense. It was the one thing that made her different from the women she was supposed to become, the one piece of herself that hadn't been bartered or claimed. She had guarded it with the ferocity of a she-wolf guarding a cub, and now she had laid it at the feet of this silent man, a fragile, desperate offering. Elias did not speak. He didn't move. He simply sat there, a graven image of stillness. The silence was no longer waiting. It was listening. It was absorbing. Clara felt as if her entire being was shrinking under the weight of it. She wanted to run, to hide, to pull the words back out of the air. Why had she said it? Why had she burdened him with her filth? Slowly, deliberately, he picked up the piece of leather and the awl again. He looked down at his work, his expression unreadable, a mask of stone. He drew the needle through the tough hide, his movements as precise and steady as before. He did not look at her. He did not nod. He did not offer a single word of comfort or condemnation. He simply went back to his mending. The rejection was so profound, so complete in its silence, that it was worse than any angry word could have been. A cold wave of despair washed over Clara. He was ignoring her. He had heard her story and had deemed it, and her, unworthy of a response. She had shown him the wound, and he had turned his back. She finished the dishes in a blur of misery, her hands moving automatically. She dried them, stacked them, and fled to the small room behind the curtain, pulling it shut as if it could hide her from her own mortification. She sank onto her pallet of furs and curled into a tight ball, the silence from the other room a deafening roar in her ears. The rest of the day passed in a haze of unspoken tension. Elias spoke only when necessary. His words directed at Benji. He did not look at Clara, and she did not look at him. She felt his presence in the cabin like a physical weight, his silence a constant, looming judgment. She had broken the fragile peace. She had brought the ugliness of the world into his sanctuary, and now she was paying the price. When evening came, he and Benji ate their meal at the table. Clara claimed she wasn't hungry, her stomach a tight knot of anxiety. She remained behind her curtain, listening to the soft clink of their spoons against the tin plates, feeling more alone than she had when she was running through the desert. Later, after Benji was asleep and the cabin had fallen into the deep quiet of the night, she heard Elias move about, banking the fire, barring the door. She heard the soft thud of his boots on the floor as he took them off. She heard the rustle of the blanket as he settled onto his own pallet. And then, there was only the sound of the wind whispering around the corners of the cabin and the frantic beating of her own heart. It was hours later when a chill woke her. The fire had died down to embers, and the desert night had seeped through the walls. Shivering, she sat up. She decided she would leave in the morning. She couldn't stay here now. She would take her chances in the wilderness rather than endure another day of his crushing silence. She pushed aside the curtain to make her way to the water bucket, and then she saw it. On the back of the simple wooden chair where she always sat, the one he had gestured for her to take when she first arrived, was a woolen shawl. It was not new, but it was clean and thick, a deep indigo color, its edges softened with age. It was his, she realized. She had seen it stored in the chest at the foot of his bed, and on the seat of the chair, placed carefully on a clean tin plate, was a thick slice of cornbread. A faint warmth still radiated from it, and it was dotted with wild honey, glistening in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. Clara stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the shawl. The wool was soft and heavy, promising warmth. She looked at the bread, a simple, nourishing offering. He hadn't spoken. He had not offered empty words of pity or awkward reassurances. He had heard her story, heard her shame, and had waited until the cover of darkness to give her his answer. And his answer was not a word. It was warmth. It was sustenance. It was a silent, profound gesture of respect. The shawl was not for the girl who had been sold. It was for the woman who was cold. The bread was not for the victim. It was for the survivor who was hungry. He had heard her entire story, had seen the ugliest part of her, and his response was to offer comfort and care, without condition or judgment. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of shame or fear. They were tears of a deep, aching relief that was so immense it felt like grace. She picked up the heavy shawl and wrapped it around her shoulders, its weight a comforting embrace. She took the bread and ate it slowly, the sweetness of the honey a startling contrast to the bitterness she had carried all day. He had heard her, and in his silence, he had understood everything. The morning after her confession was not marked by a change in routine, but by a transformation of the silence. It was no longer a void filled with unspoken questions and her own shame. Instead, it had become a space, a quiet field where something new and undefined might be allowed to grow. When Clara emerged from behind the curtain, the indigo shawl was neatly folded on the chair where she'd left it. The empty plate was gone. Elias was already outside, the rhythmic thud of his axe splitting firewood a steady, reassuring heartbeat in the cool dawn. He didn't look toward the cabin, but she felt as though he was aware of her every movement. The air was different. She could breathe it all the way in. Their lives continued to be a tapestry woven with silence, but the threads had changed. Before, the silence had been a barrier, a wall between two strangers. Now, it became their language. They began to speak to each other in a vocabulary of small, deliberate gestures, a language more honest and profound than any words could be. It started with water. Clara had taken it upon herself to tend to a small, neglected patch of earth near the cabin, coaxing a few stubborn herbs and vegetables from the dry soil. It was hard work under the relentless sun. One afternoon, as she knelt, pulling weeds with her head down, a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see not Elias, but a tin dipper of cool, fresh water sitting on the fence post beside her. He was halfway across the yard, his back to her, checking the cinch on his horse's saddle as if he had been there all along. He had seen her need and met it, without announcement or expectation of thanks. From then on, a dipper of water was always there when she worked in the garden. Clara, in turn, began to listen with her eyes. She noticed the way he rubbed the back of his neck after a long day in the saddle. The next morning, she heated water over the fire and left the basin and a clean cloth on the stand for him when he came in. He said nothing, but she saw the slight easing of the tension in his shoulders as he washed the trail dust from his skin. She learned that he preferred his coffee black and strong, and she made sure a hot cup was waiting on the table when he came in from his morning chores. These were not the actions of a servant repaying a debt. They were the actions of an observer, someone learning the rhythms of another person's life and choosing to add a small note of comfort. Benji, in his innocent way, often became the unintentional messenger between them. One evening, as Clara was trying to tie her long hair back with a piece of twine, the boy came to her holding a thin strip of soft, blue ribbon. "Elias said this was in the supply box," he said, holding it up to her. "He said maybe it would work better." Clara took the ribbon, her fingers brushing the boy's. Her eyes met Elias's across the room. He was looking down, inspecting a scuff on his boot, but she knew he had seen. She tied the ribbon in her hair, the splash of color a small, defiant bloom against the drabness of her existence. A week later, she was mending one of Benji's shirts when she noticed the poor state of her own sleeping pallet. The furs were clean, but the sackcloth pillow, stuffed with dry grass, was lumpy and rough against her cheek. She thought nothing more of it until the next evening when she went to her small room. A new pillow lay in its place. It was fashioned from a clean, soft piece of a flour sack, the faded blue lettering of the mill still visible. She picked it up. It was heavier than the old one, and when she pressed it, it gave off the faint, clean scent of cottonwood fluff. He had taken the time to gather the softest stuffing from the trees down by the creek bed and had sewn the case himself, his stitches large and masculine, but strong and even. The care in the simple object was so profound, so unexpected, that she had to sit on the edge of her pallet for a moment, the pillow held tight to her chest. This silent exchange of care began to change her. The fear that had lived in her bones for so long, the feeling of being hunted and worthless, began to recede. She had found a place where she was not defined by what had been done to her, but by the small, useful things she could do. She was not a possession, but a presence. She started to notice the beauty in the harsh landscape she had once seen only as an enemy. She saw the stubborn purple flowers that grew in the cracks of rocks, the way the setting sun painted the red cliffs in shades of fire and rose, the delicate resilience of a spider's web, jeweled with morning dew. Her fear was being replaced by a tentative, fragile courage. She wanted to give something back, not just in practicality, but in spirit. She wanted to bring a piece of the beauty she was starting to see into the stark, masculine world of the cabin. One afternoon, while walking along the dry creek bed with Benji, she found a patch of desert marigolds, their brilliant yellow heads a startling burst of sunshine against the brown earth. Beside them grew stalks of Indian paintbrush, their tips a fiery red. She stopped, captivated by the colors. Carefully, she picked a small handful of each, creating a simple, vibrant bouquet. She carried them back to the cabin, her heart beating with a strange mix of hope and apprehension. This was different from leaving a cup of coffee or mending a shirt. This was an offering of beauty, a thing with no practical purpose. It was a piece of her soul, the part that had not been hardened or broken, and she was laying it at his door. She hesitated on the threshold. Elias was not there. He was out checking the perimeter of his land. She took a breath and placed the small bunch of wildflowers on the worn wooden step, right where he would see them when he returned. She then retreated inside, feeling as nervous as a girl with her first secret. She watched from the window, busying herself with small, unnecessary tasks. An hour passed. Then she saw him, a distant figure on horseback, riding slowly toward home. As he drew closer, she moved away from the window, her back to the door, pretending to be absorbed in stirring a pot of beans over the fire. She heard the familiar sound of his boots on the hard-packed earth. The footsteps stopped at the door. The paws stretched. She could feel his stillness, his focus on the unexpected splash of color on his doorstep. She held her breath. She imagined him kicking them aside, or simply ignoring them, stepping over them as he would any other piece of trailside brush. The door opened. She did not turn around. She listened to him step inside, his spurs making a soft metallic sound on the floorboards. She heard him place his rifle in its rack on the wall. She heard the soft thud of his hat as he set it on the table. She risked a glance over her shoulder. He was holding the flowers in his hand, his large, calloused fingers, so accustomed to the feel of rope and leather and wood. looked clumsy and oversized, holding the delicate stems. He looked at them for a long moment, his face in shadow, his expression unreadable. He did not put them in water. He did not comment on them. He simply walked to the small shelf where he kept his few books and a small, leather-bound journal. He laid the flowers gently beside the journal and then turned to the basin to wash his hands. The moment passed, unacknowledged. Clara felt a pang of disappointment. It was a foolish gesture. She thought a man like him had no use for flowers. Later that night, long after Benji was asleep and the only light in the cabin came from the flickering embers in the hearth, Clara lay awake on her pallet. She could not sleep. The quiet rejection of her gift stung more than she wanted to admit. She heard a soft rustling from the main room. Peeking through a tiny gap in the curtain, she saw Elias. He was sitting at the table, his back to her. The small leather journal was open in front of him, in the dim red glow of the fire. She saw him pick up one of the yellow marigolds from the shelf. He held it for a moment, his thumb gently stroking the petals. Then, with a careful, almost reverent motion, he opened a page in his journal and laid the flower flat inside. He closed the book, pressing the small life into the pages, preserving its color and form between the silent, unwritten lines of his life. He sat there for a long time, his hand resting on the closed journal. He had not discarded her gift. He had not ignored it. He had saved it. He had taken the small, fragile piece of beauty she had offered and made it a permanent part of his own private world. Clara eased back onto her pallet, a slow, warm feeling spreading through her chest. She closed her eyes. They had not spoken a single word about it. They never would. But in the quiet cabin, at the edge of nowhere, she knew she had been understood. A silent promise had been made and accepted. Between the calloused hands of the cowboy and the trembling offering of the runaway girl, something had finally, truly, begun to bloom. The fragile piece they had built was as delicate as a desert bloom, and just as easily crushed. It happened on a late afternoon when the sun was low in the sky, casting long, peaceful shadows across the yard. The heat of the day had broken, and a cool breeze whispered through the cottonwoods by the creek. Inside the cabin, a quiet domestic scene was unfolding. Benji was sitting on the floor, meticulously arranging a line of smooth, gray stones. Clara was kneading dough for their evening bread, her hands dusted with flour, the rhythmic motion a comforting meditation. Elias sat at the table, cleaning his rifle. The metallic clicks of the well-oiled mechanism, a familiar and somehow reassuring sound in the quiet. The first sign of danger was not a sound, but a change in him. He froze mid-motion, his hand hovering over the rifle's stock, his head lifted, his body going unnaturally still. It was the same coiled stillness she had seen in the freight car, the absolute focus of a predator that has caught a scent on the wind. Clara's hands stopped their work in the dough. Benji looked up from his stones, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere.
"What is it?"
Clara whispered. Elias didn't answer. He rose from his chair in one fluid, silent motion and moved to the cabin's single window. He stood just to the side, peering out through a small gap in the wooden shutter, his body a tense silhouette against the fading light, seconds stretched into an eternity. Clara's heart began a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. She could hear nothing but the wind and the pounding in her own ears. Then she heard it, too, a distant, rhythmic drumming. So faint it was more a feeling in the soles of her feet than a sound. It grew steadily, resolving itself into the unmistakable beat of multiple horses, moving fast. Elias turned from the window. His face was a mask carved from stone, his gray eyes flat and cold as a winter sky. All the quiet gentleness she had come to know in him was gone, burned away by a sudden, terrible purpose. "The men from the train," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of grim finality. The flour on Clara's hands suddenly felt like grave dust. The air in her lungs turned to ice. They had found her, after all this time, After she had allowed herself to believe she was safe, they had found her. The fragile world she and Elias had built in silence was about to be torn apart by the noise and violence she had fled. "Clara!" His voice was low and sharp, cutting through her rising panic. "Get the boy! Go to the back room! Get under the pallet! Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear! Do you understand?" She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She scooped Benji up from the floor. The boy looked from Elias's hard face to her terrified one, and his lip began to tremble, but he remained silent, clutching a single gray stone in his small hand. She hurried behind the curtain, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure the men outside could hear it. She pulled back the pallet of furs and pushed a terrified Benji into the shallow space beneath the rough-hewn floorboards that formed the base of her bed. She squeezed in beside him, pulling the heavy furs over them, plunging them into a stuffy, suffocating darkness that smelled of dust and old wool. Through the gaps in the floorboards, she could see a sliver of the main room. She saw Elias slide the heavy wooden bar across the door. He took his rifle from the table, checked the load, and then placed it on its rack against the wall. He stood in the center of the room, unarmed, his hands loose at his sides, facing the door. He was not a man preparing to fight. He was a man preparing to meet a storm head-on. The sound of the horses grew to a thunderous crescendo and then stopped abruptly in the yard. The cabin was plunged into a sudden, deafening silence. Then, a voice, coarse and familiar, shattered the quiet. "We know you're in there, Boone, and we know who you've got with you." It was one of the men from the train. His voice was full of a triumphant, ugly confidence. "Silas wants his property back," another voice shouted, followed by cruel laughter. "Send out the girl, and we'll leave you be. Make it easy on yourself." Elias did not answer. He remained perfectly still, a silent, immovable object. Clara held Benji tighter, the boy's small body trembling uncontrollably against hers. She pressed a hand over his mouth, though he was making no sound. There was a heavy, splintering thud against the door. They were trying to break it down. Another thud, louder this time, and the wooden bar groaned in protest. Elias shifted his weight, planting his feet, his body a coiled spring. With a final, explosive crash, the door flew open, torn from its leather hinges. 3 men spilled into the room, blocking the light, their forms large and menacing. They were the men from the train, their faces unshaven and flushed with a predator's excitement. They saw Elias standing alone, and they grinned. "Just you," the leader, a big man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, sneered. "Figured you'd put up more of a fight than this. Where is she?" Elias said nothing. He simply met the man's gaze, his own eyes empty of fear. The man's grin faded. "Have it your way." He gestured to the other 2. "Find her." As the 2 thugs started to move, Elias exploded into motion. He was not a brawler. He was a force of nature. He moved with a brutal, terrifying efficiency. He met the first man's charge with a perfectly timed sidestep and a short, sharp blow to the throat that sent the man gagging and stumbling backward. He drove his elbow into the second man's stomach, doubling him over, and followed it with a heavy fist to the side of the head that sent the man crashing into the table. But there were 3 of them. The leader, the one with the scar, was on him before he could fully recover. It was no longer a fight. It was a desperate, chaotic struggle. The cabin filled with the sounds of grunts, the sickening thud of fists against flesh and bone, the crash of furniture. A chair splintered against the wall. Clara watched through the crack in the floorboards, a silent scream trapped in her chest. Elias was impossibly strong, impossibly fast, but he was outnumbered. He fought with a cold fury, giving as good as he got, but for every blow he landed, he took 2 in return. A trickle of blood ran from a cut above his eye, but he seemed not to notice. Then, the unthinkable happened. The second man, who had been momentarily stunned, recovered. Instead of rejoining the fight, His eyes darted around the room, searching. They fell upon the curtain leading to Clara's small room. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "She's in there," he rasped, and started toward the curtain. Elias saw it. With a roar of pure desperation, he threw the scarred man off him and lunged to block the way. But it was too late. The third man, the one he had first struck, grabbed him from behind in a brutal bear hug, pinning his arms. "Hold him!" the scarred man yelled, wiping blood from his lip. The second man ripped the curtain aside. He saw the pallet, the disturbed furs. "Gotcha!" he hissed, and kicked the pallet away. He saw nothing. For a heart-stopping moment, Clara thought they were safe. But Benji, in his terror, let out a small, terrified whimper. The man's eyes snapped down. He saw the edge of the furs covering the space beneath the bed. With a triumphant shout, he reached down, his big hand plunging into the darkness. Clara felt a violent tug. Benji was ripped from her arms, pulled from their hiding place with a choked cry of fear. The man hauled the boy into the room, holding him up like a trophy. He was a small, terrified creature in the grip of a monster. He dangled in the air, his legs kicking uselessly. "Well, look what we have here," the man sneered, pulling a long knife from his belt and holding its flat side against the boy's cheek. Benji froze, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it stole his voice. The fight stopped. A sudden, terrible silence fell over the room, broken only by Benji's ragged, shallow breaths. Elias held fast in the third man's grip, went rigid. The cold fury in his eyes was replaced by something Clara had never seen there before. A raw, agonizing helplessness. "Let the boy go," Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The scarred leader laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "I don't think so. We've got a new deal. Boone, you send out the girl right now, or your little pet gets his throat opened." Clara's world collapsed. This was her fault. All of it. The broken door, the blood, the knife at the child's throat. A wave of nausea and self-loathing so powerful it almost made her blackout washed over her. She had to give herself up. It was the only way. She started to move, to push aside the furs, but stopped. She saw Elias's eyes. He was looking toward the curtain, directly at her hiding place, and with a barely perceptible movement, he shook his head. "No. He's got nothing to do with this," Elias said, his voice strained as he fought against the arms holding him. "Your business is with me." "My business is with the girl Silas paid for," the leader snarled. "Last chance. Send her out." Elias made his choice, with a sudden, explosive surge of strength born of pure desperation. He drove his head backward into the face of the man holding him. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and the man screamed, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all Elias needed. He tore himself free and lunged, not at the leader, but at the man holding Benji. He never made it. The scarred man was ready. He swung a heavy piece of the broken chair like a club, catching Elias across the back of his knees. Elias's legs buckled, and he went down with a grunt of pain. Before he could rise, the leader was on him, kicking him viciously in the ribs and stomach. The third man, his nose a bloody ruin, joined in. They were not trying to subdue him anymore. They were trying to break him. The sounds were horrific, the dull, wet thuds of boots striking flesh and bone. Elias curled into a ball on the floor, trying to protect his head, but the blows rained down on his back, his shoulders, his kidneys. He did not cry out. The only sounds he made were the harsh, ragged gasps for air between the kicks. The man holding Benji watched, laughing. "That's it! Teach him some manners!" he crowed. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the scarred man stepped back, his chest heaving. Elias lay motionless on the floor, a broken heap in the center of the room he had tried to defend. He was breathing, his back rising and falling in shallow, painful movements, but he did not move. The leader nudged him with his boot. "Not so tough now, are you?" He spat on the floor beside Elias's head. He turned his gaze toward the curtain, a cruel, triumphant smirk on his face. "All right, little girl. He had his chance. Now you can come out, or we finish him and start on the boy." Beneath the furs, in the suffocating darkness, Clara ceased to exist. She was no longer a person, but a single, raw nerve of terror. The world had shrunk to the space she occupied, a tomb of her own cowardice. Every thud of the boots against Elias's body was a blow to her own soul. The grunts of the men, Elias's ragged gasps for air, the cruel laughter, it was the soundtrack to her failure. This was the price of her freedom, not paid by her, but by the only man who had ever shown her kindness, and by a small, innocent boy. "All right, little girl." The leader's voice sliced through the haze of her horror, a foul, triumphant sound. He had his chance. Now you can come out, or we finish him and start on the boy. The words were a physical blow. Start on the boy. The image flashed in her mind, a nightmare given flesh the glint of the knife, Benji's terrified eyes. Her stomach churned with a mixture of bile and self-loathing. This was her fault. Her presence had brought this plague upon them. She had run from Black Creek only to lead the wolves to this quiet, sacred place. Her first instinct was to surrender, to push aside the furs and give them what they wanted. Let them take her. Let them drag her back to Silas. It would be a penance, a just punishment for the ruin she had caused. At least Elias and Benji might be spared. But as she began to move, another thought, cold and sharp as the blade at Benji's cheek, pierced through her panic. She had seen these men's eyes. She had heard their laughter. There was no mercy in them. They were not men of their word. They enjoyed the cruelty. Surrendering herself wouldn't guarantee anything. They would take her, and they would likely still kill the only witnesses. Her sacrifice would be meaningless, just another sordid chapter in a story that would end in blood and silence. Elias's pained breathing was a shallow, desperate rhythm in the sudden quiet. He was broken on the floor for her. Benji was a breath away from death for her. Fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. Terror had hollowed her out, and in the empty space that remained, something else was beginning to form. It was not courage. It was not strength. It was the cold, hard certainty that there was no one else. No one was coming to save them. Her eyes, accustomed to the dim light, fell upon the sliver of the room she could see, and she saw it, propped against the wall where Elias had left it, not 10 feet from her hiding place. The rifle. It was a part of him, an extension of his quiet capability. She had seen him clean it, hold it, treat it with a familiar respect. To her, it had been an object from another world, a symbol of the violence she had spent her life fleeing. She had never touched a firearm in her life. The very thought of it filled her with a revulsion born of fear. But now, it was the only thing in the world that held the shape of a choice. The leader's voice came again, impatient. "I ain't gonna ask again." Slowly, like someone moving in a dream, Clara began to push the heavy furs away. She moved with a glacial slowness, a creature emerging from a long hibernation. The man holding Benji was watching the main room, his attention on the broken form of Elias. The scarred leader was looking toward the curtain, a smug, expectant look on his face. They didn't see her. Not yet. She crawled out from under the pallet, her limbs stiff and trembling. The air of the cabin was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the stink of stale sweat. She kept her body low, her torn dress scraping against the rough floorboards. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to hide, to disappear back into the darkness. But her eyes were fixed on the rifle. She reached it. The wood of the stock was smooth and cool beneath her trembling fingers. The barrel was heavy, made of cold, unforgiving steel. It smelled of oil and power. She closed her hand around it. Lifting it was a struggle. It was heavier than she could have imagined, an awkward, unbalanced weight. It felt alien in her hands, a tool of death that had no place in her world. And then she stood up. The movement was not graceful or heroic. It was the lurching, unsteady rising of a fawn to its feet, driven by pure instinct. The scarred leader saw her first. His smug expression dissolved into disbelief, then into a mocking grin. Well, look what the cat dragged in. Decided to join the party, did you? The other two men turned to look at her. They saw a slip of a girl in a torn, oversized shirt, her face pale and streaked with tears and dirt, her hair a wild tangle. They saw her trembling hands struggling to hold the long rifle, the barrel wavering as she tried to point it. They saw prey, not a threat. "Put that thing down before you hurt yourself, little girl." The man holding Benji chuckled, his grip on the boy tightening. But Clara was no longer seeing them as men. They were a single entity, a monstrous force that had invaded this home and broken its peace. She was not thinking about aiming, not thinking about the consequences. Her entire world had narrowed to a single point: the man, the knife, and the child. "Let him go," she said. The voice that came out was not her own. It was a low, ragged sound, scraped raw from the bottom of her soul. It held none of her usual timidity. It was flat, hollow, and utterly devoid of negotiation. The leader's grin widened. "Or what you gonna shoot us with that thing you probably don't even know which end the bullet comes out of?" He took a step toward her, and that was his mistake. His movement broke the spell of her paralysis. Her mind went silent. The trembling in her arms did not cease, but it was now the vibration of a wire pulled too taut. She did not try to aim for his head or his heart. She did not try to be a marksman. She simply centered the wavering barrel on the largest part of the man holding the boy. She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The explosion was a physical blow. It was a deafening, world-shattering roar that seemed to rip the air in the small cabin to shreds. The recoil slammed the rifle stock into her shoulder with the force of a mule's kick, knocking her back a step. A sharp, searing pain shooting through her arm. A scream answered the rifle's roar. Not hers. It was a high, sharp shriek of agony. Her eyes flew open. The room was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. The man who had been holding Benji was staggering backward, his face a mask of shock and pain. He was clutching his shoulder, a dark, blossoming stain spreading across the fabric of his shirt. His arm hung limp and useless at his side. The knife had clattered harmlessly to the floorboards. Benji was free. The boy stared for a single, frozen second at his captor, then scrambled away on his hands and knees, seeking refuge in the corner of the room, curling into a tight ball, his small hands over his ears. The scene was one of frozen, shocked silence, broken only by the whimpering moans of the wounded man, the scarred leader and the third man, whose nose was still a bloody mess, stared at Clara. The mocking amusement was gone from their eyes, replaced by a sudden, stark fear. They were no longer looking at a frightened girl. They were looking at a wild thing, something unpredictable and dangerous, who held a loaded weapon and had just proven she was willing to use it. The illusion of their power was shattered. This was no longer an easy job. They had come for a helpless girl and had found themselves in a gunfight with someone who had nothing left to lose. The leader looked at his wounded companion, then at the still form of Elias, then back at Clara, who was fumbling to work the rifle's lever, to chamber another round. Her movements were clumsy, panicked, but they were determined. He made his decision. "Forget it," he snarled at his men. "It ain't worth it." He grabbed his wounded comrade by the arm and half-dragged him toward the broken doorway. The third man needed no encouragement. He scrambled after them, casting one last terrified look over his shoulder at Clara. They stumbled out into the fading daylight and were gone. The sound of their frantic, retreating footsteps swallowed by the vast silence they left behind. The cabin was still. The only sounds were the pained moans of Elias from the floor, Benji's quiet sobs from the corner, and the high-pitched ringing in Clara's own ears. The rifle suddenly felt as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. It slipped from her numb fingers and clattered to the floor, the noise shockingly loud in the aftermath. Her legs gave out. and she sank to her knees. The wave of adrenaline that had sustained her crashing over her, leaving her weak and trembling violently. She had done it. She had pulled the trigger. She had shot a man. She had saved them. A groan from the center of the room drew her gaze. Elias was moving, with a monumental effort that seemed to cost him everything. He pushed himself up onto one elbow. His face was a swollen, bruised mask, and his breath came in shallow, rattling gasps. His vision was blurry, his head swimming in a sea of pain, but he could see. He saw the smoke still hanging in the air. He saw Benji, crying but alive in the corner. He saw the empty doorway, the blood on the floor, and he saw Clara. She was on her knees, her body shaking, her face a pale oval in the gloom. The fear was there, in the tremor of her hands and the wide, shocked look in her eyes. But it was different now. It was the aftershock, the trembling that comes after the storm has passed. The terrified, hunted creature he had pulled from the freight train was gone. In her place was a woman who had stood up in the face of absolute terror, lifted a rifle she did not know how to use, and fired a shot to protect his life, and the life of his child. He looked at her, and in the ruins of his home, through a haze of agony. Elias Boone saw her for the very first time. The echoes of the rifle blast faded, replaced by a silence so profound it felt heavier than any sound. For a long moment, Clara remained on her knees, the world a dizzying, unfocused blur. Then, a small, choked sob from the corner of the room broke the spell. Benji? Her own fear, her own shock, became secondary. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs unsteady, and crossed the room to the boy. He was curled into a tight ball, his face buried in his arms, his small body shaking. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering, unsure how to offer comfort when she felt so broken herself. Benji, she whispered, her voice a raw, unfamiliar sound. It's all right now. They're gone. He looked up, his face a mess of tears and dirt, his eyes wide with a horror that was too big for his small frame. He saw her, and with a desperate cry, he launched himself into her arms, burying his face against her shoulder, his small fists clutching the fabric of her shirt. Clara held him tightly, rocking him gently, murmuring soft, meaningless words of comfort. She was no longer the frightened girl. She was a shield, a sanctuary for this terrified child. And as she held him, her eyes were drawn to the center of the room, to the still, broken form of Elias. He was lying on his side, his face turned away from her, his breathing a shallow, worrying rattle. The sight of him, so powerful and immovable, now so terribly still, was a pain sharper than the recoil of the rifle. The vigil began in that moment. The world outside the cabin, the setting sun, the rising moon. The men who had fled into the desert ceased to exist. Her universe was now the four walls of this small, violated room. And its inhabitants were the three of them, a shattered but breathing trinity. Getting him to the bed was the first, monumental task, after Benji's sobs had quieted to exhausted shudders. She settled him on his pallet behind the curtain with his favorite smooth gray stone clutched in his hand. Then she returned to Elias, kneeling beside him. She gently touched his shoulder. "Elias," she whispered. There was no response. The skin beneath his shirt was clammy, but a radiating heat told of a fever already beginning to build. She knew she couldn't leave him on the hard floor. He needed to be on his bed. She tried to move him, pulling at his shoulders, but he was a dead weight, a mountain of a man she was helpless to move. Despair, cold and sharp, pricked at her. But then she looked at his face, at the dark bruises already forming, at the dried blood caked at his temple, and the despair burned away, replaced by a grim resolve. She would not be helpless. Not anymore. She found his spare blanket and, with tremendous effort, managed to roll him partially onto it. Then, inch by agonizing inch, she began to drag him across the floor. She pulled until her muscles screamed and her hands were raw, her breath coming in ragged sobs of exertion. It took what felt like hours, a slow, desperate journey across a few feet of wooden floorboards. Finally, she got him to the edge of his bed. Getting him onto it was another battle, a clumsy, frantic struggle of leverage and sheer will. When he was finally settled, lying limp on the mattress, she collapsed onto the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion, her hands covered in his blood. The first night was a blur of fever and fear. His breathing was shallow, punctuated by pained, unconscious groans. Clara moved in a trance, tending to him with an instinct she didn't know she possessed. She tore strips from the hem of her own ruined dress to make bandages. She fetched water from the bucket, her hands shaking so badly at first that she spilled half of it. She gently, meticulously, cleaned the cuts on his face and hands with a damp cloth, her touch as soft as a prayer. She sat by his side in the darkness, a lone sentinel, listening to every breath, her hand resting lightly on his forearm, as if she could will her own life force into him through her touch. The days that followed bled into one another, a long, seamless stretch of quiet, desperate work. The sun would rise, and she would move to the fire, preparing a thin broth she knew he couldn't eat, just to have something to do. Benji, recovering his own spirit with the resilience of a child, became her silent partner. He would fetch water from the well, his small hands gripping the bucket handle with a fierce determination. He would sit quietly by the fire, watching her, a small, solemn guardian of their broken home. Elias did not wake. He drifted in the gray, silent ocean of unconsciousness, his body locked in a fierce battle against his injuries. The fever raged. Clara spent hours bathing his face and chest with cool cloths, trying to quell the fire that was consuming him from within. She learned the rhythms of his unconsciousness, the periods of restless tossing, the times of deathly stillness. She spoke to him in low whispers, telling him he was not alone, telling him Benji was safe, telling him he had to come back. She was no longer sure if she was speaking for his benefit or for her own. On the third day, Benji came to her while she was sitting by the bed. He was holding a piece of rough, gray paper, the kind used for wrapping supplies, and a stick of charcoal from the fire. He held it out to her. On the paper, he had drawn a picture. The figures were simple, the kind a child would draw. There was a very tall man with a wide hat, and a smaller figure of a woman with long, scribbled hair. In the drawing, they were holding hands, and next to them was a very small boy. Above them, a circle with rays coming out of it represented the sun. It was a picture of a family. It was a picture of them. Clara felt a lump form in her throat. She took the drawing from him, her fingers tracing the simple, hopeful lines. "It's beautiful, Benji," she whispered. The boy pointed to the table, and she understood. He wanted it displayed. She took the drawing and propped it up against the small stack of Elias's books, right where he would see it if when he woke up. It was the boy's vigil, his own silent prayer rendered in charcoal. That afternoon, the silence in the room began to feel heavy, oppressive. It felt like the silence of a tomb. Clara looked at the books the drawing was leaning against. She picked one up. The cover was worn, the pages soft with use. It was a book of poems by a man named Emerson. She opened it to a random page and, in a soft, hesitant voice, she began to read. "What is success? To laugh often and much, to win the respect of intelligent people and the affection of children." Her voice was unsteady at first, but she continued. She read about nature, about self-reliance, about the quiet strength of the soul. She didn't know if he could hear her, if the words were reaching him in the deep place where he was lost, but the sound of her own voice, reading words of strength and hope, filled the empty spaces in the room and in her own heart. It was a way of fighting the silence, of pushing back against the encroaching darkness. She read for hours, until her throat was hoarse and the light began to fail. She was in the middle of a passage about the constancy of the stars when she felt it, a flicker. A muscle in his hand, the one lying palm up on the blanket, had twitched. She stopped reading, her heart leaping into her throat. She stared at his hand, hardly daring to breathe. Had she imagined it, she waited. Nothing. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, washed over her. She was about to start reading again when it happened again. This time it was unmistakable. His fingers, long and calloused, curled inward slightly. A slow, deliberate movement. Clara leaned closer, her own hand hovering over his.
Elias,
She breathed. His eyelids fluttered. A low groan escaped his lips, a sound of immense pain and effort. He was fighting his way back to the surface. She watched, her entire being focused on his face. As he struggled to open his eyes, it was a slow, painful process. Finally, they opened. They were cloudy, unfocused, clouded with pain and confusion. They roamed the shadowy ceiling of the cabin before finding the small drawing Benji had made. Resting on the table, they lingered there for a moment, and then they moved, searching, until they found her. He looked at her, and the confusion began to recede, replaced by a glimmer of recognition. His gaze dropped from her face, down her arm, to her hand. She had, without realizing it, rested her hand on his forearm, his eyes fixed on it, on the point of contact between them. It was a look of profound, silent acknowledgement. He saw her hand, the hand that had brought him water, that had cooled his fever, that had held a rifle. His lips, cracked and dry, parted. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. "Shh," she whispered, her voice thick with tears of relief. "Don't try to talk, just rest. You're safe." He held her gaze, and even through the pain, she could see the question in his eyes. It was the same question she imagined he'd had when he last saw her, kneeling on the floor amidst the smoke and chaos. "Are you all right?" She knew what he was asking. It wasn't just about the men, it was about the fear that had defined her, that had driven her across the desert and into his life. She looked down at their hands, hers small and pale against the bruised skin of his arm. A small, watery smile touched her lips. She had faced the very thing she had spent her life running from, and she had not broken. She had not been saved. She had participated in her own salvation. She met his gaze again, her own eyes clear and steady. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said, her voice soft but sure, a quiet truth spoken into the stillness of the room. "Not since I met you." The homestead healed slowly, its recovery mirroring the man who was its heart. The first task, after the immediate, frantic care of Elias, had been to mend the door. Clara, with Benji's small hands passing her the tools, had taken the splintered planks and, using Elias's leather and nails, had pieced it back together. It was a clumsy, ugly repair, but it was solid. It shut out the night. It made them safe again. She scrubbed the blood from the floorboards until her knuckles were raw, exorcising the violence from their home with soap and water and sheer will. Elias's return to consciousness was not a sudden awakening, but a slow, painful crawl back from a great and silent depth. For days, he was a creature of instinct, responding only to the touch of the cool cloth on his brow or the taste of water she patiently spooned between his cracked lips. He slept, his body engaged in the deep, unseen work of knitting itself back together. Clara and Benji moved around him in a hushed reverence, their lives revolving around the quiet rhythm of his breathing. The first time he spoke her name, it was a rough, broken whisper in the dead of night, and it caused her heart to stop in her chest. She had been dozing in the chair beside his bed, her head nodding with exhaustion. "Clara," he rasped, and her eyes flew open. He was watching her, his gaze lucid in the faint moonlight, the fever finally broken. From that moment, his healing truly began. It was a slow, arduous process, His body was a roadmap of the violence it had endured. His ribs were cracked, his shoulder was wrenched, and a deep, abiding pain was his constant companion. The stoic stillness that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a profound and humbling vulnerability. There were days when the pain was so great he could not speak. His jaw clenched, a fine sheen of sweat on his brow. On those days, Clara would simply sit with him, her presence a quiet, unwavering anchor in his sea of agony. Their silent language deepened, evolving to accommodate this new reality. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, to know when he needed water, when the pain was cresting, when he simply needed the quiet comfort of her being there. She would help him sit up, her arm gentle but firm around his shoulders, her own body straining with the effort. He, in turn, began to watch her with an intensity that went beyond mere observation. He watched her mend his shirts, her head bent in concentration, the blue ribbon she always wore a slash of color in her dark hair. He watched her share her portion of bread with Benji, a soft smile on her face. He watched her move about the cabin, bringing order and a quiet, resilient life back to the space the violence had shattered. He was seeing the woman who had saved him. Weeks passed. The harsh glare of summer softened into the golden light of early autumn. Elias, with a grim determination that was both frightening and inspiring, began to reclaim his strength. He started by sitting up for longer periods, then by moving his limbs, testing the limits of his broken body. The day he first stood was a quiet, monumental victory. He pushed himself up from the bed, his face pale, his entire body trembling with the strain. Clara and Benji stood back, watching with bated breath, their hands unconsciously clenched. He stood for a full 10 seconds before his legs gave out, and Clara was there, catching him, helping him back to the bed. He did not see it as a failure. He had stood. The next day, he stood for 20 seconds. He fashioned a crutch for himself from a sturdy cottonwood branch, whittling it down with his knife as he sat by the fire. It was his first act of self-sufficiency since the attack, and Clara understood its importance. The first time he walked, it was from the bed to the door, each step a carefully measured, pain-filled effort. And then, one clear, cool afternoon, he decided he would go outside. He stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on his crutch, blinking against the brightness of the sun. The world he had created, the world he had almost died for, was still there. The windmill still turned. The corral fence still stood. The vast, silent land still stretched to the horizon. Clara came and stood beside him, not touching, but close enough to offer support if he needed it. "The door," he said, his voice still rough from disuse. He looked at her clumsy but effective repair. "Benji helped me," she said simply. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. He looked at the repaired door, then at her, and his eyes held a depth of gratitude that no words could have conveyed. He took a hesitant step out onto the porch, then another. He walked to the edge of the yard. Clara, a silent shadow at his side, and stood for a long time, just breathing the clean, dry air. He was a king reclaiming his kingdom. When he finally turned to go back inside, a wave of dizziness from the exertion washed over him. He swayed, and her hand was instantly on his arm, steadying him. He leaned on her, and for the first time, she was the strong one, her slight frame supporting his weight. They walked back to the cabin together, a single, unified movement of shared strength and vulnerability. Life found a new rhythm, a rhythm of partnership. Their days were filled with the small, necessary tasks of survival, but now they performed them together. In the mornings, he would sit at the table, his hands busy with tasks he could do while seated mending tack, sharpening tools, braiding a new rope. Clara would move around him, asking for his guidance. "Is this how you bank the fire for the day? Does the horse need more oats?" He would instruct her in his quiet, economical way, and she would listen, a quick and capable student. The corral fence, damaged in the fight, became their shared project. He could not do the heavy work. but he could direct it. He sat on a crate in the shade, showing her which posts needed reinforcing, how to stretch the wire taut, how to tie the knots so they would hold against a stubborn horse. She worked under the sun, her hands becoming calloused, her muscles growing strong. They were a team, rebuilding their home, their fortress, one post at a long, laborious post. The sharing extended to everything. A meal was no longer something she prepared for him, but something they made together. Him slicing vegetables at the table, her stirring the pot at the hearth. They would eat in a comfortable silence, a simple look across the table conveying everything. This is good. You are tired. We are safe. The silence was no longer an absence of words, but a presence, a warm, living thing that enveloped them and testified to the deep, unspoken bond they now shared. One afternoon, the light was the color of warm honey, and the air was filled with the sweet, dusty scent of autumn. Elias, now walking without his crutch, though with a pronounced limp, announced he was going to walk to the creek. Clara watched him go from the doorway. Then, on an impulse, she followed. She caught up to him in the small pasture that bordered the creek bed, the place where the desert marigolds and Indian paintbrush grew in defiant, vibrant clumps. He was standing by the fence line, one hand resting on the top rail, looking out at the way the golden light touched the distant red rocks. The land was peaceful, beautiful, a stark contrast to the violence it had witnessed. Clara came and stood beside him, her shoulder almost brushing his. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the shadows lengthen, listening to the gentle murmur of the wind through the dry grass. It was a perfect, peaceful moment, the kind she had never believed she would experience. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the terror of the freight car, the desperate flight across the desert, the fear and the blood and the long nights of his vigil. It had all led to this quiet pasture, this golden light, this man. She remembered the feeling of hiding in the darkness beneath his coat. Her world shrunk to the scent of dust and leather, his presence the only thing between her and a terrible fate. She had been so small then, a creature of pure fear. Look at her now, standing beside him, under the vast, open sky, his equal, his partner, his savior. The truth of it rose in her, a feeling so pure and certain it was as elemental as the earth beneath her feet. It was not a flight of fancy, not a girlish dream. It was a fact, forged in silence and terror and grace. She turned her head to look at him. He was already looking at her, his gray eyes softened by the warm light, holding a question he would never speak. She spoke into the quiet, her voice a near whisper, yet it carried all the weight of her journey, all the truth of her heart.
At first,
She began, her voice steady.
I only asked to hide beneath your coat.
She saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He remembered. Now, she continued, her gaze unwavering, holding his.
I just want to stand beside you for a lifetime.
The words hung in the golden air between them, a pledge as solemn and binding as any vow spoken in a church. It was not a question. It was not a request. It was a declaration, a statement of where she belonged. Elias did not speak. His expression did not change, but a profound stillness came over him. The stillness of a man who has heard a truth he has long known but never dared to hope for. He slowly, deliberately, lifted his hand from the fence rail. It was calloused and scarred, the hand of a man who knew hardship and work. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers wrapped around hers, his grip not tight or possessive, but warm and sure and endlessly steady. It was an answer. It was an acceptance. It was a promise given in return. They stood there as the sun dipped below the horizon, hand in hand, two solitary figures who had found their home not in a place, but in each other. His hand closed over hers. It was not a sudden movement, not a grabbing or a claiming. It was a slow, deliberate settling, as if his hand had finally found the place it was meant to be. The skin of his palm was a landscape of his life, a terrain of calluses, old scars, and ingrained trail dust. Yet the pressure of his fingers was impossibly gentle. It was a touch that spoke the language they had perfected, a silent vocabulary that said everything words could not. It said, "I heard you, I understand, I accept, yes." The sun had finally surrendered to the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised canvas of purple and deep orange. The air grew cool, carrying the scent of dust and the faint, sweet perfume of the wild marigolds at their feet. For a long, breathless moment, they simply stood there, joined, two solitary figures rooted to the earth, the vast, silent land their only witness. Then, with the same gentle pressure, he began to walk, leading her not by force, but by a quiet, irresistible invitation. They left the fence line and started back toward the cabin, their joined hands swinging in a slow, natural rhythm between them. Their steps fell into a shared cadence, his longer stride shortening to match her own. They were no longer two separate people navigating a difficult world. They were a single, unified movement. A shared journey that had begun with a desperate flight and had now found its own unhurried pace. They did not speak. There was no need. The silence was not empty. It was full, rich with the weight of her pledge and the quiet power of his acceptance. Clara watched the ground move beneath her feet, every rock and clump of grass familiar. Yet, in this moment, the entire world felt new. She felt the steady strength in his hand, a current flowing into her, a promise of an anchor in any storm. She was not following him. She was walking with him. The distinction was everything. They walked through the pasture where she had once gathered flowers to offer him a piece of fragile beauty. Now, the beauty was not something to be offered, but something they inhabited together. The evening star pricked the darkening sky, a single, brilliant point of light. The windmill, their faithful sentinel, creaked a soft, rhythmic song on the breeze. As they reached the edge of the hard-packed yard, in the shadow of the cabin, he stopped. He turned to face her, his tall frame a silhouette against the last vestiges of twilight. He did not release her hand. Instead, his other hand came up, not to touch her face or her hair, but to rest gently on her other arm, his touch a steadying, respectful presence. He stood looking down at her, and, in the deep twilight, his gray eyes seemed to hold all the quiet gravity of the night sky. The scars on his face, the lines etched by the sun and by hardship, were softened, revealing the man beneath the weathered exterior. He had been a rock, a fortress, a silent protector. Now, in his eyes, she saw the man who had gathered cottonwood fluff for her pillow, the man who had pressed a wildflower between the pages of his journal. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble, the sound of stones shifting deep beneath the earth. It was the first time he had spoken of what lay between them since her confession, since she had laid her broken past at his feet. "You're not like the others," he said, the words simple, direct, holding no artifice. He was not speaking of her virtue, she realized. He was speaking of her spirit, of the girl who had run, the woman who had fought, the survivor who had healed him. His gaze was steady, unwavering, holding hers with a profound and gentle honesty. "And I have no wish to be like the men who were with them." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow, but it was a blow that shattered the last of her chains. He was not just accepting her. He was defining himself in opposition to the men who had hurt her, to men like Silas, to her own father. They were men who saw women as objects, as property, as prizes to be won or purchased. He was drawing a line in the sand, placing himself on the other side, the side of respect, the side of honor. He looked at their joined hands, then back at her face, and delivered the final, quiet truth that would redefine her world. "I want to be the man you choose," he said, his voice soft but clear as the evening star above them. "Because you choose it." A single tear escaped her eye. Then another. They were not the hot, shameful tears she had cried in the past. They were cool and clean, like a spring rain washing the dust from a long, unopened window. They were tears of a relief so absolute, so profound, that it felt like being reborn. A slow, watery smile spread across her face, a dawn breaking after a long, dark night. He had not claimed her. He had not possessed her. He had given her back the one thing that had been stolen from her, the right to her own choice. He was not accepting her pledge as a form of surrender. He was accepting it as an act of her own free will. He saw her not as a prize he had won or a stray he had saved, but as a promise of a shared future, freely and consciously chosen. She did not need to speak. Her smile, the tears that traced shining paths down her cheeks, the light that bloomed in her eyes, it was answer enough. He saw it, and a quiet, almost imperceptible softening happened around his own eyes. A silent acknowledgement of the new world they had just created together in the twilight. They stood for a moment longer, and then, as one, they turned and walked the last few feet to the cabin. The door, with its ugly, beautiful scars, stood as a testament to what they had survived. He released her hand to lift the latch, and they stepped inside. The fire in the hearth was banked low, a bed of glowing red embers. Benji was asleep on his pallet, his face peaceful, the smooth gray stone still clutched in his hand. The drawing he had made was still propped on the table, a child's simple, perfect vision of their family. There was no need for a rushed wedding, no need for the words of a preacher or the sanction of a law they lived so far beyond. A ceremony would have been a pale imitation of the vows they had already exchanged in terror and blood and silence. A piece of paper could never hold the weight of the bond they had forged. They had something far greater, something far more real. They had trust, the kind of trust that is built when one person pulls another from a moving train. The kind of trust that is earned when one person stands between the other and a loaded gun. The kind of trust that is proven when one person nurses the other back from the brink of death. Clara moved to the fire, adding a log, the flames leaping up to cast a warm, dancing light across the room. Elias barred the door, the heavy thud of the wood a sound of final, peaceful security. He turned and watched her, and she looked back at him, a quiet smile on her face. Their home was whole. Their world was safe. They were not two broken people hiding from the world. They were a family, forged in the heart of the unforgiving West, bound by a silent promise, standing together, by choice, for a lifetime. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like to help this story reach more listeners. Please also consider supporting us by hitting the hype button